In last week's video, I took an overview of the Enterprise figures and I concentrated on the crew across a couple of different waves. But in today's video, I'm going to be taking a look at the aliens that were released as part of this line, but also the Bridge playset. So to kick us off, I'm going to be looking at Klang. Klang was the only Klingon released in this line. He is of course from the pilot episode Broken Bow. And the first thing you'll notice, this is a brand new body mold. He is much bigger, much chunkier, and much more solid than the other figures in this line. Thankfully, he doesn't suffer as badly when it comes to the rubber applications of this figure. The only rubber to be found here is on the skirt of the tunic at the very bottom, which works quite well. It obviously allows for a lot more flexibility in the legs, and thankfully, it isn't too distracting on the eye. It doesn't look too discoloured, too dissimilar to the rest of the outfit. So there's a little bit of discoloration there, but overall, this looks pretty solid. And I think this is an example of where this rubber works really well and complements the figure rather than hindering it and making it look a bit odd or a bit strange or hindering the articulation in any way. The head sculpt is pretty good. I like that they've opted for a snarling face. It's definitely an action pose, which is quite cool. The only thing is I'm not quite sold on the waving hair effect. It looks great when you put him in certain poses. It definitely looks like he's windswept and, like I said, it's mid-action point, so that's really good. But if you want a more relaxed pose, then it doesn't look quite right. It looks a little bit strange when he's just standing head on. The hairpiece thankfully is a soft rubber though, so it will allow some flexibility when you are turning the head, which is really good. And the articulation for this figure is exactly the same as we saw in the other Enterprise figures. He does of course have that ball jointed neck, he's got the ball jointed shoulders and the single jointed elbows, the swivel wrists, the hinge hips and the single jointed knees. And for accessories he comes with his disruptor, which looks really cool. Overall, I think this is a really nice looking figure. It is screen accurate, they've done a nice job. There's a little bit of colour here and there to sort of make it a bit more exciting, but overall, I think the reliance on brown is kind of a dull choice for the costume, but that is not Art Asylum's choice, that's definitely a show issue. I do really like that he has that snarling expression there, it definitely brings a lot more character to the figure, and overall his general size and demeanour is much bigger. As we can see here against Captain Archer, he's a much bigger, much broader figure, and that's entirely appropriate for the Klingons. So I think they've done a really nice job producing this figure. Next up we have one of the series' main reoccurring villains, and this is of course Cylic, the Suluban. The overall presentation of this figure is pretty much spot on, it is very screen accurate and they've done a really nice job bringing it to life. The paint apps are nicely applied and he's probably the most colourful character and figure in the whole line. Art Asylum decided to be a bit more creative and experimental with Cylic. So for his articulation you notice they extended the rubber to the arms, so his arms are literally one rubber piece. This mirrors what happens in the show because they are genetically modified and they, a bit like Mr. Fantastic, they can stretch parts of their limbs and their body so they can slide under doors and things like that. As a figure though, I'm not sure how I feel about it. I'm not keen, as you know, on the rubber application throughout these figures as a rule anyway. Again, Cylic does suffer from the rubber pants in the crotch area, which naturally are a different colour because of course they are a different material and will continue to discolour over time and possibly perish as well. Now extending this to the arms, I think it's a nice touch, I think it's very creative and I like that they made the effort to make him different and interesting. I'm just not convinced by it because obviously it doesn't mean you can really put him in many poses because his default is to snap back into that long arm effect, so you can hold it in place but you can't really keep it in any other position. The other key difference with Cylic is that he has extra articulation at the ankle. There's a swivel there that allows his foot to spin 360 degrees as well as the hinge. And for accessories he does of course come with his phaser pistol as well. Overall, this is a nice looking figure. I think they've done a very good job with it. Certainly he's the most colourful, which I appreciate. And because the sculpt is generic enough to be either Cylic or any of the Suluban, you do have the potential to army build here as well, which is really cool. The only thing against that, of course, is the head sculpt, which is, it's a snarling head sculpt, which normally I'm in favour of, but when you want to army build, it's not so good. In the second wave of figures, they also released the Norsken Captain. This is only the second time this character has ever been released in any line at any scale. And although the Norskens only appear in one episode of Enterprise, I think they were a good choice to release because obviously the fandom is very familiar with them from Star Trek The Next Generation. And they are an alien that is a little bit more action orientated. So as we can see here, the Norsken came with a knife and a phaser as well. And it's nice to see that he actually has a fair amount of colour on this figure as well. There's the nice yellow piping and of course the green underneath his shirt there, so that's quite cool because the line overall, it does feel very monotone, it does feel a little bit dull in terms of its colour. And again, the body mould is unique to this figure, so just like as we saw with Klang, he's a bit bigger, a bit broader than the standard crew figures and allows for a better sense of scale and diversity within this line. It's important to remember that Art Asylum were making figures based on the first season of the show, and you can definitely see they were trying to pick the most toyetic characters. But I do think it's a shame because as the show progressed they went on to introduce lots more unique and interesting aliens. For example, the season 3 Xindi reptilians would have been a really cool addition to this line, and probably would have been my preference over something like the Norsken. And finally, we have Shran the Andorian. I'm really glad they did this guy. He's actually quite difficult to pick up now, but obviously he would go on to be a reoccurring character throughout the series, and certainly became more prominent towards the latter half of the show. Plus, I think the figure is really nice. His antennae are articulated so you can bend them in different ways, and he also comes with his phase rifle. I think the overall presentation is pretty solid, he's nice and colourful, and he mercifully doesn't suffer from the rubber effect. They opted not to give him the rubber pants or the rubber torso, which is brilliant. So after all these years, he probably stands up the best. Plus, I've always had a bit of a soft spot for the Andorians. I always really quite liked their look, so I'm probably biased. Okay, so now on to the pièce de résistance, the bridge playset. Art Asylum had a very ambitious idea, and that was to release 4 figures with a piece of the bridge set, that when you bought them all and connect them together, you had the entire set from the show. Even better, each part of the playset would have unique sounds. I think this is an absolutely wonderful idea, and it's the kind of thing that fans just absolutely adore. But sadly, it was something they would only try once, and it was with the Enterprise crew. They wouldn't try this again with any of the other lines that they produced. They wouldn't do it with the Next Generation or the classic series show. And sadly, it is something of a damp squib because it was unfinished. They only managed to produce 3 of the 4 pieces. Thankfully, the 3 they managed to get out pretty much assembled most of the bridge anyway, so we're still left with a pretty cool overall effect. So the outer packaging, as you can see, has the standard grey nuts and bolts look and feel of the individual carded figures, but of course has that wonderful window display where you can see the action figure but also part of the playset behind them as well. It also highlights the fact that you can try me to press one of the buttons to hear the sound effects. The reverse of the packaging shows what the entire bridge set would look like as a blueprint. So if you had all 4 pieces connected, it shows how they connect together. They've shown production stills from the actual TV show rather than the toy, each component of that bridge. And at the bottom here you can see the Mayweather helm console, which is the piece that was sadly missing, and this would have gone in front of the captain's chair. Whilst on the right hand side of the packaging we can see all the figures in the line that you can pick up across those 2 waves. And here it is once it's fully assembled and out of its packaging. The 3 pieces do connect together quite nicely. As you can see, there is that rather unsightly gap where the Mayweather helm console should be, but otherwise I still think this looks very presentable. Each piece is made of surprisingly light plastic, so overall this isn't a heavy set or very bulky to move around, and there is some wonderful attention to detail throughout the set. So we can see here from Reed Station, all the buttons and dials and flashing icons that we see in the show have been faithfully recreated, and I think they've done an absolutely wonderful job of this, and I think it's a very exciting design, and I think it just looks really great to have this in toy form. I think it's really cool. Another really nice touch is that there is an element of articulation as well, so a bit of interactivity here. We actually have the seat that can rotate all the way around and can slide forwards or backwards from the console. However, the major problem with this set is the fact that the figures don't really sit in it very nicely, and again this is purely down to that frustrating rubber pants that they have. It really hinders the articulation. As you can see, it bags up there a little bit and it forces the figure up into an upright position, so they never sit comfortably in their chairs. So you kind of have to persevere a little bit and try to make it work, but over time they're always going to work themselves up out of the chair. And at the base of the set there is a button that if you press it, plays some sounds.
Charging weapon. We're ready, sir. Then fire. Permission to launch a torpedo.
So moving on to the captain's chair, this is of course the central piece of the playset. This is the command centre where Captain Archer sits, so it is primarily just the chair, and of course it does have the protective rail behind it as well. What little detailing there is can be found in the arms of the chair. So obviously Archer has his computer panel that pops up on the right hand side there, which is quite nice, and the right arm also extends to give him a bit more manoeuvrability as well. So again, doesn't add a great deal to the playset, but it's a nice little detail from the show which they've captured here, which is really great. The chair itself clips firmly into the base, so it's very solid. There's no danger of it popping out or falling away. And the seat is made of a solid rubber, so it feels quite textured, but also is a very hard, solid piece, and it feels very firm. But of course, just as with Reed, the real problem comes when you try to place Archer in the seat. This is a fantastic idea, and I'm convinced that if it didn't have that rubber, those rubber pants there, he would sit in it perfectly, and this would look just amazing. Sadly, that isn't the way they went, and as a result, what tends to happen is he tends to sit himself up into a sort of almost standing position, and it just looks like he slid into the seat, and it doesn't look great. But if you're willing to persevere and take some time with it, you can get it into a good position, a nice compromise that you can just firmly sit him down and get something looking approximately like it does in the show. And I think if you invest the time and you put the effort in, you can get a result like this, and then it is worth it. And just as before, there is a button behind the seat which plays some sounds.
How we doing, Trip? Ready when you are. Prepare for warp. Let's go. My name is Jonathan Archer. We're on a mission of exploration from the planet Earth. Pulse waiting. It's up running.
Now sadly, I never got the T'Pol piece of the playset. But the good news is that you can essentially take the Reed playset and replicate it on the other side, since it is more or less the same anyway. So I think there may be individual changes, little differences on the display screen and the buttons, but overall the shape and size of the playset is exactly the same. So if you're struggling to pick up the T'Pol piece, which I think is the harder one of the three, then pick up a secondary Reed like I did and you'll have more or less the complete set. And when you do put it together, I think you're going to be very pleased with the results. The set feels really dynamic, and it does bring it to life from what you see on screen. And honestly, how cool is it to have the bridge for our 7-inch scale action figures? I love that they did this. I think it's fantastic that they have added in the sound effects and tried to just generally recreate what you see on screen. I think they've done a wonderful job with it. And when you throw in the other characters and have them dotted around the bridge set, it just looks brilliant. It just comes to life, really, and I think it's a wonderful addition to the lineup. And I think the only tragedy is that, of course, we didn't get this completed. We didn't get the Mayweather piece, which would have been the icing on the cake. I think the major stumbling block with this set is actually the figures themselves. Again, that was an artistic choice made by Art Asylum, and I can understand and I appreciate them trying to do something different, but I think those rubber pants there really are a massive letdown. I don't think they work the way they were intended to, and ultimately they do work against the articulation when you're putting them in the seats, so you are fighting against that all the time. But other than that, I think this is a really fun set, and I think if you can take the time to track these pieces down and cobble it together, then it's going to be well worth your time and your money, because it is such a wonderful centerpiece of the collection. I hope you enjoyed the vid. If you did, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe, as I will be posting more videos soon.